Hey everybody, it's Zach again at newtotorah.com. Wanted to come in and do a video for you again today. Hey, listen, I get a lot of emails, and some of the emails are good questions, and I want to be able to address, I would like to address all the emails I get, but I just can't. I get too many of them. And so I really appreciate those who are understanding and are patient with me. Listen, if you want to send me an email sometime, go ahead and send it 2-3 times if I don't respond the first time, because I just may, first of all, I may not have seen it because I'm just so busy running around here all the time. And number two, if you send it, chances are eventually it'll get across my eyesight and I'll be able to respond maybe if I have the time. It's just I don't have the time to respond to each and every email I get. But usually the ones I respond to are mostly the reason of just because you caught me at the right time. And number two are something usually I'm passionate about or I feel strongly about. And so a guy named Peter sent me a message on the Facebook page, and I wanted to respond. I think it was Facebook. Yeah, Facebook. And I wanted to respond and take a look at this. And so Peter writes this: Shabbat Shalom, can you please tell me more about the law of unclean men and women? Must we still keep that law? And if so, how do we do it in our system, being our circumstances? So I am assuming, just by looking at your question, Peter, that I'm assuming that you are talking about the Torah of the law of unclean when it comes to men as being referred in Leviticus 15. Now, Leviticus 15 is usually the one that's talked about. Listen, people who are new to Torah, people who are just coming into the understanding that the Torah, the law, the commandments are still to be kept today, and that Yeshua, our Messiah, in the New Testament was specifically talking about keeping the Torah, and the things that the churches have taught us all throughout the centuries and are in our modern day, that the Torah is done away with, that the law is done away with, do not actually line up with what the Messiah taught and what his disciples did. And so people who are new to Torah, they go back and they realize this and they start studying the Torah. And they get to Leviticus 15, amongst some other things, especially like Leviticus 11 and Leviticus 17 and some other ones, and they hear about the things that are clean and unclean, and they start asking questions. Well, how does that affect us today? And Leviticus 15 especially is important for people who are married, because this comes up a lot in our modern day and age, and if the Torah is done away with, we should examine some of these a little bit closer. And so, without getting too graphic on some things, let's first talk about Leviticus 11, because I think Leviticus 11 is talking about, number one, is talking about the dietary instructions, but Leviticus 11 also talks about, I believe, just common sense sanitation issues that come up. And I know this is hard for some people to take who are in my audience, but I truly believe Leviticus 11 at the end of the chapter is talking very clearly about people who would be even butchers of clean animals. Someone who, say, butchers a cow, which is considered a clean animal because a cow has a split hoof and it chews the cud. I believe a butcher, someone even like me, who would harvest a deer that we do on numerous occasions on our land during hunting season. If you harvest a deer and you butcher it, you're unclean until even. And I believe that's very clear when it comes and talks about Leviticus 11, verse 39, starting right here. And if any beast of which ye may eat die, he that toucheth the carcass thereof shall be unclean until even. And he that eateth of the carcass of it shall wash his clothes and be unclean unto even. He also that beareth the carcass of it shall wash his clothes and be unclean unto even. So talking about people who eat the carcass and who bears the carcass, that would be the butcher. And people will say, no, Zach, this is an animal that dies of itself. Well, that is not talked about anywhere in Leviticus 11. That's talked about in other places of the Torah, like Leviticus 17 and some other places. If you do a quick Google search, dies of itself, Bible, you'll come up with all kinds of places in the Torah that talk about an animal that dies of itself and how it's not to be eaten, especially by a priest, or it can be eaten by somebody, but then you have to be unclean until even. And so what I believe Leviticus 11, 39 and 40 is talking about are people who eat meat and who butcher meat. They're unclean until even. And so people will automatically associate being unclean with sin. And that's not what it's talking about. Just because you sit down and eat a steak of a clean animal, whether it be a deer or a cow or a lamb, it doesn't make you a sinner. Being unclean is not a sin, and this is what comes to the crux of the matter. What Peter, I believe, is talking about in his letter, is it a sin to be unclean because you think, oh, I'm dirty, and people associate being dirty with being unclean. And you can make some references of that, in the Torah, but the confusion lies in it's not always the case. And so we have to really understand this. And I know some people have a real hard problem with this when they think that eating meat is unclean or dirty or sinful. It's not, okay? But here's the deal. Leviticus 15 and the 31st verse of Leviticus 15 spells it all out, I think, and I think it brings it all home. Being unclean is not a sin. But in those days, going before the altar, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, in a state of uncleanness, that's not being a sin, but going before that altar in that state of uncleanness is a sin. Okay, so that completely turns everything on its head at that point. If you understand, if you ever understand unclean and clean in that context, okay, going before the altar, having just had a steak, because listen, here's the deal. They didn't have like forks and knives. I mean, who knows if they had forks and knives back then, and if they had napkins, and if they had a place to wash. When you get done eating a steak, a nice juicy steak, and you have a big beard like I do, you're going to have some, we big guys who have beards understand that our food gets caught in our beard sometimes. You don't go before the Most High, the creator of the universe, after just had a steak, with steak juice and mashed potatoes and whatever else you got on your beard, and on your hands, after eating that steak, okay? You don't do that. You're unclean at that point. You have the juices of that animal on your face. It's the same thing for anything. You go look at all these unclean, clean laws, and you go before the creator of the universe in a state of uncleanness. You don't do that. And so verse 31 of Leviticus 15, I think, drives the point home that when your wife is in the middle of that time of the month and during that state of her separation, if you've been with your wife right at that point, if you lived in the house, you sat in the same chair, and it's very clear, I think, in Scripture not to be with your wife during those times, that is in fact a sin, that you don't go before the altar during that time. She does not come before the altar and give an offering during that time. You don't go before the altar during that time. And if you're a priest, a Levitical priest, and one of your job duties is working in the temple, that should be a very serious time for you. That, at that time, you should probably separate from your wife, because you shouldn't touch your wife. You have duties that you have to carry out during your time in the temple. And if your wife is during her time of separation, you probably shouldn't live with her at that point. You should probably separate at that point. You should probably sleep in separate beds. Now, Judaism today takes that into a whole new arena. They take, there is no temple right now, okay? There's no altar that you have to go up before and visit, okay? But if there was, and you had to, you would make sure that you were clean at that time. And we even see in the New Testament examples where Paul is cleansing himself in the pools right there by the temple, cleansing himself because he's been out amongst the Gentiles. He's unclean according to Torah. And so he goes through a time of purification, a time where he can cleanse. This is New Testament, folks. So you can't tell me that, the Torah is done away with. Here's Paul in the New Testament in the book of Acts going through purification before he goes up to the temple to offer offerings. I believe it's chapter 21 in the book of Acts. And so he's doing this. He's going through this process because he's been out amongst people who have touched dead bodies, who maybe have touched their wives during their time of uncleanness, during their time of separation. Okay, so he's going through the process before he goes up to that Temple Mount and before that altar, that's a functioning altar, and he's going through a time of purification. He's cleansing himself before he does so. And so I see you have here really two witnesses. Leviticus chapter 15, verse 31, it says, "Do not come to me in this state of uncleanness, lest you die." Lest you die. And so I think that applies for everything. Eating a clean animal or even touching an unclean one, you're in a state of uncleanness. Okay, even eating an unclean animal is definitely a sin. Okay, it makes you unclean. But even eating a clean animal, in my opinion, makes you unclean to go before that altar. And so, check this out. When Mount Sinai was happening, and for those of you who disagree with me, check this out. For when Mount Sinai was happening, what happened? The Father says, "Do not come to your wives 3 days before you come to me." Because why? We know later it puts them in a state of uncleanness. Leviticus 15 tells us that when you and your wife are joined together, you are now in a state of uncleanness, and you should wash and be unclean until even. Because why? Even because the new day starts at even. And so you're unclean at that point. Do not come to the altar, do not come to the tent of meeting at that point because you're unclean, lest you die. And so what did the Father tell Moses? Tell them not to come to me, not to come to their wives 3 days before they come to me. It's the same thing. Do not come to me, do not approach my altar, do not approach my holy mountain in a state of uncleanness. When you come before me, you better be clean. What did Isaiah say? My lips are unclean. And then the angel brought a coal over and burned his lips to purify him. And so coming before the Father is very serious business. You come to him in a state of cleanness, being clean, set apart. You don't come to him in a state of uncleanness. And we have to understand what is unclean. We also have to understand that being unclean is not necessarily a sin. Coming before that altar in that state of uncleanness is a sin. That's very important to understand. Okay? And I know people out there disagree with me. There's a lot. Folks, this is a huge issue in Judaism. Because there are women out there, married couples, and I know a few, who have not been able to have children because they take what Judaism says in Leviticus 15, and instead of actually what Leviticus 15 actually says, and they take it to the extreme of the takanot, the added commands of man, and they can't have kids today. Because basically, here's the deal. Go to Leviticus 15, it's verse 19. Verse 19 is talking about the state of separation for a woman during her monthly menstruation. Okay? And during that time, 7 days, a count of 7 days begins from the start of that time until she's no longer unclean. 7 days. Well, verse 28 is what Judaism says from the time of the end of the uncleanness, from the issue of blood, there begins a count 7 days. Well, if you do that for a woman, if you do it from the time of the ending of her menstruation, and then you start a count of 7 days, usually the point of ovulation happens during that 7 days that follows the end of the menstruation. And so if you have a period of separation 7 days after the menstruation, you're probably going to miss ovulation on a lot of people, and you're not going to be able to have kids. And there's a lot of Jewish women today who are in Judaism, and they interpret it that way, the way the rabbis interpret it, which I believe is incorrect, and they can't have kids today. And so that's just one of another problem that we can go into about, the traditions and doctrines of man over the commandments of God. And so that's not what it's talking about. Leviticus 15, verse 28 is not talking about a woman's monthly cycle. It's just not. It's talking about what's beginning at verse 25, and that is an additional issue of blood that's outside of the menstruational period, the cycle of a woman. And so that's a huge issue for a lot of people today because they put a tradition and doctrine of man, rabbinical Judaism, over the commandments of God. They've reinterpreted something incorrectly. And so this is a pretty big issue. And so Peter writes about this issue, the clean and unclean. Now listen, here's the deal, folks. Being unclean is a big issue, I think, in the eyes of our Father and Creator. And so I understand that people have tried to take this a little bit further, but their intentions, I think, are okay. The problem is the Father takes this issue of uncleanness very seriously. Take a look at Galatians 5:19, Paul's words in the book of Galatians. Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness. Well, look at that word, uncleanness. Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness. The works of the flesh. These are, the things that Paul mentions in Galatians 5:19. All of these things, all the way down to Galatians 5:21, envyings, murderers, drunkenness, and all the things that he's mentioning there are all violations of the Torah commandments. These are very serious things. And he says at the end of verse 21, they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom. These are serious issues. So being unclean is a very serious issue. Going out and eating pork, people say, well, God never says anything about the New Testament about not eating pork. And they take, Peter's writings, the vision of Peter in Acts chapter 10 as one of the ways that we can eat pork again. Well, if anybody ever tells you that, go and turn to Galatians 5:19, uncleanness. Well, what does it say about swine in Leviticus 11? He is unclean to you. So this is very serious, and it keeps people from the kingdom. The problem is when we take traditions and doctrines of man and elevate them over the commandments of God, we start to run into problems. And so people who are new to Torah, people who are just coming into Torah, they read Leviticus 15. They're reading the commandments, and they understand, okay, this is something that is serious. What does this mean for us? They have questions. And so this is how we interpret this. This is how I interpret this. Leviticus 15, Leviticus 11, Leviticus 17, these are all things that have to do with the clean and unclean, and they are very serious things. We should try to keep these to the best of our ability, but understand being in a state of uncleanness is not necessarily a sin. It does not keep you from the kingdom. Dwelling in that state of uncleanness, I do believe, does keep you from the kingdom. Reveling in that state of uncleanness, I believe the Father sees as a sin and keeps you from the kingdom. Going before the altar, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, what would be the temple, in that state of uncleanness is absolutely a sin. We don't have a temple today. We don't have an altar. There's no Levitical priest system today. And so you and I are not Levitical priests. And I believe Leviticus 15 is talking specifically, predominantly about those priests who are going to have to come and perform duties in the temple. They better be careful, when their wife is in that trial of that temporary time of separation, to go before that temple. It could be death for them if they did. And so that's important. Verse 31 of Leviticus 15 is very important. All right, hope that clears it up. I understand this is a big topic. People will disagree left and right, and that's fine. We're all trying our best to understand Torah and interpret Torah and keep the commandments as best as we know how. We need to take these commands seriously. They are to be followed today. We should try our best to keep these commandments. What happens is, what I think we should be wary of is putting the traditions and doctrines of man over the commandments of God and adding to and taking away from the commandments. So let's do our best to try, as we know it, to keep these commandments. And that includes the commandments that have to deal with the clean and the unclean. All right, we'll leave it at that. Go home, read your Bible. Thanks.